Well, hey, Courtney, this has been coming for a while just to sit and chat and talk with you. I know a lot of people on my page, we talk about religious deconstruction to the way our lives have taken shape and what we're doing with purpose and all of these things. And I know that your story, I have had opportunity just to sit and listen to it before, but I know that it was on Instagram and I didn't quite know how to get that off Instagram onto Facebook. So we're going live on Facebook today just to hear your journey of religious deconstruction, but just your whole journey and how it's progressed into becoming the NGO that you are, doing trafficking work and all of that, because I'm sure it all segues together in a beautiful thing. So Courtney, we worked together. We did some stuff in Amsterdam together around trafficking. And
Many years ago.
yeah, years ago, and we've remained friends, and it's just been a real neat journey to watch you evolve and become who you are today. So can you just introduce yourself and tell people about yourself?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Like she said, my name is Courtney, and I've been doing anti-trafficking work now for the last 11 or 12 years and met you as part of that journey. And I've been in Romania for the last six and a half, working with at-risk kids in the state system here. So we do a lot of prevention work, alongside some intervention work. I also am a consultant for one of the UN agencies doing counter trafficking work, so a little bit higher level in the government. But yeah, I mean, I grew up in a very conservative, fundamentalist kind of religious environment, Christian environment. And that, of course, has shaped me to be the person that I am today. I grew up in the wonderful movement of purity culture and
Oh,
all of that
yes. Yeah.
that era, of course, yes. And so, I would say that faith has been a big part of my journey. I mean, it is part of what led me into the work that I do because of this call for justice and, loving my neighbor and that sort of thing. But of course, in the years of being in this work and living abroad, a lot of questions kind of just started to rise for me. Things just didn't make sense always with the way that I grew up seeing them,
Mhm.
or the gospel that I had been given. It didn't always make sense in the context that I was working in. So that's what really prompted that deconstruction kind of journey for me. And now, years later, I feel like I'm in a much healthier and more open and spacious and inclusive space. And so, yeah, faith has very much always been a part of my life. I would consider myself to be a very spiritual person in general, but yeah, I mean, it still remains to be a big part of my life. It just looks much different now on the
Right,
other side.
right. And I know we've talked about that because I was doing missionary work and then, we kind of met in a very Christian context was
Yeah.
how it all happened for the two of us. And you
Yes.
were in trafficking and I was in that as well. And we were just moving through that. So I want to backtrack a bit about a few things that you mentioned. So you said the words purity culture. And I was wondering if you could just shed some light, because I know that this can look different for everybody, but what purity culture meant for you at that time and how that affected you. What did it do?
Yeah, so I would say that that's a really big part of my story. I did not grow up in a church with a youth group and that sort of thing because I come from such a small community. So I knew about purity culture and the purity rings and the purity pledges and that sort of thing kind of through the grapevine, but I didn't really get exposed to that firsthand until I went to college. And growing up, I grew up in Texas, and so you had there's also cultural elements at play that I think just almost feed into the whole purity culture thing, but definitely just the idea of, abstinence and definitely grew up with a lot of ideas around our bodies, our desires, everything like that being sinful. And so, if you had a sexual thought, it was sin. If you had
Right.
a desire in your like a physical or sexual desire, it was sin. So a lot of those teachings I really took on, or I took it to heart, and it really, I think, affected my development in a lot of ways, and just I really saw myself as, this bad, sinful kind of person, and it, affected my self-worth and
Mm.
that sort of thing. And especially with the teachings, the horrible examples that are often used of like the rose with, the rose petals being
Oh
plucked off,
gosh,
the chewed
yes,
up, the gum being passed around from person to person
yes,
to person. Definitely was around those kinds of
yeah,
teachings. And, I mean, it really does affect you mentally and emotionally. And it affects the way that you view yourself, and it creates this sense of shame and fear around any and everything related to our sexual selves, our bodies, our, physical beings even. And so I was highly affected by that. It definitely drove me to get married really young, and, it's just this quest for purity. And to save a lot of time, in recent years, I've actually been diagnosed with CPTSD, so complex PTSD from my religious trauma, but specifically that purity culture element, because it highly affected the way that I viewed myself in relationships. And it's been a huge journey. I'm on the other side of it now. I feel like I've really overcome a lot of it and have been able to heal and have a much healthier view of myself, of my value and my worth as a person, and, sexuality in general. I think I have a much healthier view of those things. But yeah, that's been a huge part of my
yes,
journey. It was horrible.
yes. And shame, you were mentioning a lot of elements of shame. So let's take a moment and look at that. The elements of shame that you struggled with personally, you can share as much as you want, or or as little as you want, but shame shows itself in a variety of ways for people. And so what did it look like for you?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think that kind of like what I mentioned, there was this fear of, that I was going to mess up somehow. I was going to sin. I was going to do something wrong. And I think that anytime that I was in uh, relationships, or, even just talking with friends or whatever, anytime anything would come up that could potentially even be sinful, it almost then became this shameful thing, right? Because it was like, well, that I'm not a good enough person. I'm
Oh
not a good
yes.
enough Christian.
Oh
I'm
yeah.
not, I'm not pure. I'm not this, I'm not that. Even if it was just like the smallest thing, I mean, I had friends, I can remember sitting in a dorm room. This is a great example. And, friends talking about their boundaries, their physical boundaries, and how they were going to maintain their purity. And, some of them, it was just holding hands, and others would kiss, or, you could maybe touch on the arm, but nowhere else. And
Right.
hearing some of these things, I'm like, oh no, I haven't thought about this. And because I haven't thought about this, I must be a really bad person. Like it came, every little thing became shameful for me, because again, I didn't grow up with this framework necessarily, but as I was introduced to it, it's like it all locked into place based on other really terrible theological views that I was given as a child. And so, yeah, so I mean, even just the smallest things around physical boundaries would become a source of shame as I was trying to navigate this. And then there was also the cultural pressure of, ring by spring. Um,
Yes.
and feeling ashamed, like, oh, like there must be something wrong, or, there's something, you know, yeah, like, yeah, something about me that, like, oh, if I don't get married by this time, then, I'm not fulfilling even
Mhm.
the societal pressures. So yeah, there was a lot of fear, a lot of shame, and I would say a lot of just self hatred almost. I don't know if hatred might be too strong of a word, but just definitely had a negative view of myself in a lot of ways.
It sounds
As a
like your
result.
nervous system was on overload with trying to keep the appearance of, because it talks about this in the Bible, right? You can't have an appearance of evil. And so you were doing
Mhm,
everything you could to not have that appearance. So,
mhm.
well, how did you cope? How did you, I mean, as a young person growing up, like what did you do? What did you do to make it through?
You're right. It was all about appearances. And I mean, this is just outside of the whole purity culture thing, but just, trying to maintain that good Christian girl status.
Mhm.
It was very much about appearances, other people's opinions and views of me, people pleasing, all of it. I was 100% that person. And I don't know if I really coped well with it. I would say that I just lived in with a very dysfunctional nervous system for many, many, many years until I started to put the pieces together. Yeah, I mean, I've always struggled a lot with anxiety, with, yeah, like I said, people pleasing and that sort of thing. I think that how I coped was to become what everyone expected of me
Absolutely.
or what everyone wanted me to be,
Yes.
and not I never had the courage or even really the knowledge to know how to become my authentic self. And that didn't come up until these last like 3 or 4 years that I've stepped out of those poor coping mechanisms and into authenticity and really becoming okay with, whether it's disappointing someone, being misunderstood, all of those things. Like now I can stand in that place and be okay, but in the past I couldn't. It was just, I have to please, I have to be the good girl. I can't be seen any other way. And I would shape and shift and bend and do whatever was necessary to uphold that image, to be accepted, to be loved,
Right.
to fit in. Yeah.
And so you had this struggle with having to appear a certain way before people. So now let's bring God into this, okay? Because God is the other flip side to this thing. So where were you at with God in all of this, with the purity culture and keeping in appearances and everything being around marriage? Everything revolved around marriage. Like that was the highest destiny for a woman, was to be married and have children. So can you talk a little bit about God, where God fit in with that in your framework?
Yeah, I would say again, like when I went to college, I really started to take my faith very seriously.
Mm,
It's not that I didn't necessarily take it seriously when I was younger, but I just didn't have necessarily the resources at my disposal because of just how small of a community I grew up in, as I mentioned. So I really took it seriously. I got super involved in church, all the things. And then after college, I moved to New York City and I maintained my affiliation and my involvement with church. But I
mhm.
will say that I was exposed to a much healthier version of a Christian community in New York. It was definitely not this fundamentalist kind of environment that I grew up in. And so it was for sure a step in the right direction. And it really opened me up, even just to the possibility that, Christians can, drink or smoke a cigar or do whatever, like all these things that I was like, wow, like there are people that are doing this, so it was definitely like a huge step forward. But I for sure continued. It was this mix of like I was growing and I was evolving.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I was still also carrying this weight of all these things with me, right? And then like I said, it wasn't really until I got to Romania. So, I mean, I entered into, I was never a missionary, but like I started an NGO and got involved in this work, like I said earlier, like out of my calling,
Mhm.
what I really believed that God was calling me to do. Um, and it was in Romania that then that started to break down. So it's like God was very much a part of all of it, and continued to be, and I can share a little bit more later, but like maybe still continues to be just in a very different
Sure,
way now.
sure.
Um, but yeah, so I think it's like my faith had slowly evolved. Then I got to Romania, it all started to fall apart a little bit because
That's
things were
crazy.
not
That
adding up.
happens, isn't it?
Yeah.
Huh.
And then now, even in just this last year, I've been able to, I think, get to a much healthier place with it all. So, it's been a journey for sure.
Sure. So with God, did you feel the pressure to be perfect in God's eyes? Or, because some people have it where, like for me, it was I had to be perfect within the church's eyes. And my story, I came out of a whole lot of different stuff. And so then I had to like put this pure image, I had to have this certain image. And that was before people, but then this transferred over to this like God complex that I then had to like really stick to these standards, that it talks about walking in the spirit. I got to stick to those standards with God. Did you have that same type of pressure, or were you more comfortable with how you thought God felt, but it wasn't everybody else?
Yeah, I would say probably the latter, at least to a good degree. I think I've always been able to differentiate between what is pressure from people and from the church versus how I felt like God himself or herself, however you want to talk about God. I'm like, whatever. Yeah. How I was viewed by the divine, let's say. So I've always had a very strong spiritual connection to God. And I think that, again, even though there was some warped views along the way, I always had this sense that I am valuable and loved by God. But that was not always the message that I was receiving from the church and from the communities that I was a part of. And so, yeah, I think it has been easier for me to not have as great of a sense of anger towards God as my anger and my issues have really been more pointed towards the fundamental kind of evangelical spaces that I came from.
That's beautiful, because I think a lot of times that doesn't happen. It didn't happen with me. I had the anger towards God in a variety of ways because of how it had been taught. So let's move on to this whole it broke down moment, okay, where everything breaks down. And this is the whole point with religious deconstruction, right? And I know we can compare notes on this as us who've been working in areas of social justice internationally and all sorts of different things. You start to ask questions because you start to say, well, I was taught this way, and that doesn't work now. I'm looking at this over here and that's not matching up. Or where was, the goodness of God to be found over in this situation as, it was taught to us, or all these different things. So let's talk about your breakdown, because mine happened as well while international.
Yeah, there were a couple of things that happened. One, I was working and still do work with very vulnerable girls. Like I said, they're coming from these state orphanages. I'll just call them that. That's not necessarily the politically correct term at this moment. They're called placement centers now, but a lot of people don't know what that means. So we'll go with orphanages. So yeah, I'm working with these girls, and I'm sitting there thinking to myself, okay, this version of the gospel that I had been given, which is, you believe in Jesus and it saves you from going to hell, essentially. How is that good news to these girls? Because in my view, like, they're kind of living in hell right now. So I don't really understand, like, how is it going to be good news for me to tell them that if you believe this, in, let's say 60, 70 years when you die, like, you'll go to heaven, like that it didn't really seem like that good of news after all. But there was also an incident that happened where a young boy from these centers, he passed away. He died from a battle with cancer. And I think that there was just this moment. I was at the funeral, and, he was in the hearse with the casket, and the other kids were in these vans kind of behind. And I was just looking at all of them, again, tears streaming down their face. It was just this horrendous scene. Because you have this 16-year-old boy laying in a casket. And again, thinking about the things that I grew up believing. I wasn't necessarily believing it to the same extent at that point. I feel like that's a good thing for me to say, but I just got really angry at the fact that there are people that would believe that, like, this young boy could go to hell because
yes,
he was old enough, right, to have the conscious awareness to make a choice.
Yes.
And I just thought, he has lived and his story is just horrible, with his family and everything. And so it's like, he has lived such a terrible life. And how are we to sit here and to say that, like he might have this destiny and things. So it really started to all break down, because I'm just like, I'm working with these kids that are coming from just the worst of the worst of the worst
Yes,
situations
yes.
imaginable. And how is this not bad enough? And like,
Right,
how
right.
could we then damn them to, something like eternal conscious torment because maybe they didn't hear the right message or whatever. So it really was that, it was all of that combined that was this, it just led to this breakdown of that specific belief.
And so where did this breakdown end up taking you? Because now it feels like a lot of people, and I can speak for myself, that the whole concept of hell was almost like the gateway to the slippery slope of everything related to even just American Christianity, related to the Bible, related to what it meant to follow God, all of these things. The slippery slope started the minute I chucked hell out the door and thought, this cannot be right. And of course, I looked into different things. I don't know, we'll talk a little bit more about how you unpack some of this, but I researched, I looked, I listened, I talked to theologians, I talked to Jewish, rabbis. I had intense discussions. It wasn't just like, oh, well, I no longer believe in hell and I'm just going to talk. No, I wanted to know, okay, this doesn't mess up. Now, why is that? Why is this not mixing right with me? So how did this slippery slope for you continue to progress? Because it did.
I would say kind of similar to what you just said. I started to unpack a lot of this. I began to do my own research, learned that, oh, there are multiple atonement theories. And oh my gosh, like, this isn't necessarily like a long-standing view in church history. This eternal conscious torment idea, or this idea of that, like, that's not something that has been necessarily believed over the course of time. And has been hotly contested, in
It has,
the,
yes.
yeah. So yeah, so I mean, I agree. I think that once that door opened and I began to see like, wow, there's a whole other world of belief and thought and whatever. I mean, even just within the Christian tradition, much less outside of it, but within the Christian tradition, there's so much to be considered and that has been thought about and talked about, and other ways of viewing things. It really just unlocked this whole world for me. And it really took me down the path of deconstruction, or what I sometimes like to refer to as renegotiating,
I love it.
my faith and my spirituality, because there was a sense of freedom to it. It was scary
Oh, yeah.
because I mean, like you said, it was like you're stepping out and it's like, oh my goodness, like this whole new world to be discovered. But at the same time, it was also very empowering, because then it meant that there wasn't just this one narrow viewpoint, that at least for me, especially at the beginning of all this, it's like I wanted to maintain my Christian faith, but like I couldn't necessarily keep what it had been. So for me, like in those beginning stages, knowing that like this is all still under this umbrella and it's been accepted across, different spans of time and denominations and things and whatever, like, yeah, it was just the most freeing and empowering, but also scary thing that I had encountered in a while. So yeah, it's been a journey.
Yes, totally. And so how has relationships changed with you? I know sometimes when you go down this track, if you have a lot of my friends were in the church, and a lot of those people I no longer have as close ties, not because I didn't want that. There
Mhm.
seems to be just this kind of view. You mentioned at the beginning about the word inclusion, which is a big one. And it felt like once I started on this path, there was exclusion, there was excommunication. We don't want to have things to do with you. And I remember thinking to myself, well, this can't be the message of Jesus. That wasn't the message of Jesus. The message of Jesus wasn't like, hey, like since you're, where you're doing something a little bit differently, I'm just gonna, remove you. And so talk a little bit about how this has shaped, like even just maybe your relationship with your family, relationship with friends. What did that look like?
Yeah, I think overall I've kind of been a little bit more quiet, let's say, about my journey. Like I haven't been as open maybe as some people are. Like I haven't posted a lot on social media or, whatever. I think also just, personality and things, but the conversations that I began to have with people kind of in my close circle or within family or things, over especially in that first, I would say like couple of years, definitely got a lot of concerns, a lot of, messages kind of like, well, you better be careful. It's a slippery slope. You might be letting, the devil might like
Right
get a
in.
foothold in there. Um,
Oh,
so yeah, like you need to be careful. And especially, reading people like Richard Rohr or whoever, it was like, oh no, like, that
yes.
is, you're definitely just opening yourself up and you have to be really careful and you might be losing discernment, and I think that when I started to receive a lot of that messaging, a couple of things happened because one, like I was still kind of recovering or still trying to unpack that good girl, that good Christian girl
Yes.
mentality. And so some of that, it did kind of shut me down a little bit because it was like, oh no, I was having that internal battle. Um, but I think that, I mean, it also just made me really angry
Yes.
because
Oh,
it
that's,
was just like,
yeah.
there is so much more to be explored here. And I felt like a lot of people were just trying to control me because my journey was making them uncomfortable.
Wow.
And so it was again, it was at this time where I was starting to step into more of who I really am and step out of some of these poor coping mechanisms and step out of this good girl behavior. But I mean, of course, it was like, standing on shaky ground right at the beginning. And then of course, with little by little, it became more and more comfortable for me to step out. And again, I still haven't necessarily like publicized a lot of things. Like, so I think there's a lot of people in my life that may or may not even really know where I am or what I'm doing, or, with faith and spirituality and all of that. But definitely have been able over time to be more open and just to kind of stand in the discomfort of people's reactions, whether they agree or not, because it's not my job to keep someone else comfortable. That's something that I've learned along the way. And it's like, I'm not comfortable with this traditional, fundamentalist evangelical view of God. And so I'm not going to adhere to that just because it would, maintain the peace, which is not real peace anyways. So yeah. Yeah.
So, oh, I love talking to you, Courtney, because we have these discussions a lot, where we talk about these things, we unpack things, and I think we're on a growing journey, both of us. So let's talk for a second about American Christianity, because you're in Romania and there's Christianity that's there, and I'm in England and Christianity's here, and we've been all over the world and Christianity's all over the place. But one of the areas I think we can speak into is American Christianity, which is its own brand.
It
It's
is.
the way that it deals with social justice issues, which we will be coming to here, the way that it deals with just people in general, humanity, being human. It almost is its own culture. So talk to me a little bit about what you have discovered with American Christianity.
Yes. I mean, Christian nationalism is definitely a thing.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that especially with the more time that I live abroad, the more that I am able to see that more, like objectively. So I would say that there is definitely this huge connection between American politics and conservative evangelical Christianity. And that obviously filters into every aspect of our lives. And, the way, it's not to say that religion doesn't have an influence in other parts of the world, but it is just very different.
Yes.
I think that, even with the rise of Trump and, his biggest supporter base being American evangelicals or conservative evangelicals, it really shows what certain priorities are. And it's all about maintaining this idea of, the traditional family, pro-life initiatives, that sort of thing. And the conservative traditional values. But I think that what is interesting is that those aren't even necessarily always biblical values.
Yes.
So I think that that's something that's very interesting. It's like, from the American evangelical perspective, oftentimes what they're fighting for are really traditional American values, and not necessarily biblical values. Because, you look at the way that things are often talked about or thought about, and it's like, that's incompatible with the Jesus that's in the Bible that they claim to follow and to believe. Like, they're not even on the same page. Their minds, somehow they are. And so, yeah, I think that, it's crazy how much power the American church has.
Yes.
And it really does shape, it shapes our politics. It shapes even international policies, as we're seeing now play out in the current conflict between Israel and Gaza. They're definitely, it's a very influential business in the US.
Sure. And so, you do social justice work, you work with human rights, as I did. And as one who is a gay woman, the way that the evangelical fundamental church treats the LGBTQ plus community is damaging and destructive. And there's a shaming and there's an exclusion of this community. There's a continual, you need Jesus, a continual framework there. And then when you can take it down even to certain issues, even related to even trafficking that we've talked about and different types of things, sometimes they'll jump in and it will be great and it will be wonderful. But in general, what I have seen with the way churches have handled issues like trafficking, or have handled even mental health, just we're looking at mental health or the LGBTQ plus, it lacks something. And it becomes all about an agenda and a conversion of people. So how can the church, I know I'm asking kind of a sweeping question here, but how can the church help and be like a hospital and a place of love and inclusion and kindness for areas of social justice that we work in, we've done? What's going on there?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that came to my mind as we were talking there, I think that from my experience, and I think you would agree, everything within the church often gets labeled as spiritual. And then there's a lot of spiritual bypassing that happens.
Yes.
So when it comes to mental health, for example, it's like, well, maybe you're anxious, but you just need to have more faith, or you just need to pray about it. Or this idea of like, oh, but you're a new creation. So in Christ, so the old is gone and the new has appeared. But it's like, that is not how it works in real time. And I think that for me, one of the things that's been so helpful is understanding and almost not segregating in a way of like making it, an individual silo, but just knowing when something is an emotional issue, when something is a mental issue, when something is a physical, a sexual, a spiritual issue. I think that there can be congruence. There can be a way to integrate all of those things, but we also have to really say that, someone's sexuality and their sexual choices is not necessarily automatically a spiritual issue. And so I think it has to be, there has to be this separation, to be able to acknowledge that, hey, like, if someone was abused as a child and there is trauma that exists today from that experience, like just because they maybe are following, a Christian faith doesn't mean that all of a sudden it's going to be okay, or that they can just pray it away, or that they can just be healed miraculously. Like they might actually need to, access to mental health services, to counseling and therapies and things to deal with the trauma. Like we can't continue to spiritually bypass everything. And I think that, even with social justice matters, oftentimes it's, we're going to just convert people to Christianity
Yes.
in order to handle or to deal with these very complex issues. But again, it's like we are spiritual beings. I believe that, but that is only one component of many that make us human beings. And so I think that that's where there's a big failure oftentimes, because it's not a holistic view of us as people. It is a very narrow view of just a spiritual component of who we are.
Yes, yes. And if there is any signs of humanity, like an emotional moment, let's say, then there can still even be that bypassing. Well, it's okay, honey, you're crying because you know you are in sin, and that's why you're crying. Instead of maybe we're crying because we're frustrated that you're putting us in these boxes, or we're frustrated that you're relegating it to sin and ignoring the fact that these type of things happen. I would like for you, because I know this is a big one with you, to talk about being trauma informed, because I think there are issues within the church that pastors aren't counselors. They're not counselors. They may have gone through Christian counseling. They may have done a few little things here and there, but a lot of them they just are not informed with trauma. So talk to me about being trauma informed, because I believe this is really important.
Yes. Before I do, I want to say one other thing related. It just came to my mind. I would say that one of my biggest, one of the most helpful things, I'll say it this way, one of the most helpful things along, for me personally with my healing journey has actually been it's been the ability to connect to my humanity.
Yes. Yes.
To be human, because before it was like, I felt this pressure again with shame, with fear, with beliefs, with whatever, of like, everything about me is bad. My heart is bad. My body is bad. Everything is bad. And I think that as I've been able to connect to my humanity, to my humanness, it has been such a healing space for me. And I think that the irony that I've discovered, and I think you would agree, is that I found that the road that has led me back home to myself is the same road that leads us to God.
Yes.
Like the road home to ourselves is the road home to God, whatever that means, for you. But because it's like there's just something really beautiful about connecting with yourself and becoming who you were created to be, or flourishing in your humanity.
Yes.
Depending again on what view you hold, but it's like, if you believe that you were even a created being, why wouldn't you want to flourish in what you were created to be? So I find that those are the same roads, but we're told that they're not, because if you focus too much on the human parts of yourself, then you're taking your eyes off of God or whatever it is.
Well, it says in the Bible that you can't walk in the spirit and not fulfill the lusts of the flesh. And the whole thing around the flesh will be a lot of that humanness, a lot of who we are, and like all of this, and to call it lust and to call everything that makes us who we are is damaging. And I actually feel like it's insulting. If you to tell someone that they can't have certain human feelings, I feel is insulting to the Creator, to God. Okay, that's insulting. Exactly. You're saying that your humanity, that'd be like somebody looking at you, Courtney, and saying, well, your humanity is just less than, and God, who's created you the way that you are, and all the beautifulness, the intricacies, all of it, you're actually insulting the one who created. And so Yeah, it's funny. We've had these discussions before about reclaiming humanity, reclaiming ourselves. That was a big one for me because everything in Christianity was about the spiritual. But you can see that in all sorts of different spiritualities. Everything becomes just about the spiritual. And we're just forgetting the fact that I think everything is spiritual in one way.
Yes.
But then there's also human. It's okay to acknowledge your humanness and be proud of your humanness and say that, you know, maybe I didn't have a great day today. But that's part of the human experience. We learn from that. The sharing in each other's human struggle, the story of struggle, instead of trying to pull people constantly. It's like, we're going to pull everybody out really quickly out of this because that will make us more comfortable, the church. It makes the church more comfortable if they can quickly get through this human piece and bring it back to God. In the meantime, God has emotions, created us with emotions, all of these things.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I mean, 100%. So then to answer the question about being trauma informed, to go down that path a little bit, you know, I think because we're human and because we have stories, and most of us, you know, are coming from childhoods, and it's, you know, it's one of just the unfortunate things about being human. I don't think any of us really make it out unscathed, right? Like, even if you have like great parents and you grow up in a, you know, a relatively good home, often there's going to be some issues that you carry with you no matter what, because like we're human. But I think that in the course of being trauma informed, you mentioned a big one, at least within like church spaces, is that pastors are not therapists and they should never be treated as such. So I think promoting proper mental health care is a big one. But I think that something that we train on a lot here in Romania with the people that we work with is we have to recognize the story that someone is carrying, the impact that it has on things like attachment, on their nervous systems, how they form relationships, how they show up in the day-to-day. And we have to learn that like not everything is personal. So we can't take, you know, someone's behavior personally. And we really have to take into account, you know, the past and where they're coming from and what they're bringing to the table with them. So in the context of the kids that we work with, you know, they might freak out over something small, but, you know, it's like we constantly have to work to remember that they're coming from, you know, a really difficult background. And so maybe that small thing in this moment, they're actually responding to something else, something that their nervous system has associated with that small little thing. And of course, there's a big reaction that's coming out. But, you know, we have to always be reminded and looking for what in their story is contributing to this moment. And I think that when we can separate, again, the human, the person, the valuable and worthy, beautiful human being that's in front of us from, you know, their behavior and maybe the things of their past, like when we can kind of separate that, we can hold their humanity and treat them with dignity, while we give grace or space or whatever for the messiness that life brings. And so I think that that's something that oftentimes religious spaces don't do a good job of, is like, you can't be a messy human, you can't be imperfect, you can't not have it all together, like you've got to have, you can't be living in sin or doing whatever, you know. It's like, no, you have to have it all together, and you got to be that good girl and or good boy or whatever it is. And it's like, no, like we can still be valuable, worthy human beings and still have a story and still have triggers and have a nervous system that's been, you know, shaped and created in a certain way based on our experience. And like those are things that are outside of our control, but it doesn't change our value or who we are as people.
Yes. Wow. I could sit and listen to that again and again and again. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. So, you've reclaimed yourself in many ways, and you're helping women reclaim themselves as well. So give us a few tips as to how you reclaimed yourself. What did that look like? Because there was a lot of reframing, I know, and a whole lot of stuff that took place. But what was massive for you in this reclaiming of you? What did that look like?
One of the things that happened was that I actually did just step away for a long time from any and all kind of Christian things, because like I had to discover who I was outside of that space. I knew that if I continued to read the Bible, for example, or whatever, like it was just going to continue to harm me, because that the only lens, I only knew one way of reading it and only one lens of looking through all of this stuff. And so I knew that that was not helping me. So that was a decision that ended up being the right decision for me, was to step away. And yeah, I mean, I just like, I think it was, again, connecting with my own self, my own humanness, and realizing that, I guess in a way, maybe like coming up with a new framework, new boundaries,
Yeah.
a new way of seeing the world. And yeah, I guess like I'm trying to think about the best way to say this here. Sorry. I'm like, oh, what a question. Because it's been a process, right? It's like, how do you summarize like something that's been such a journey? But I will say, so like I definitely I worked with a therapist very deeply over the last few years. And one of the things that I told her was that I feel like my insides and my outsides don't match. And I want them to.
Yeah.
And so there's been this process of me doing some trauma therapy to help to overcome some of the nervous system dysregulation and the different things that are a part of, or have been a part of my experience. Because the less triggered that we are, the less, reactive that we are, the more that we can show up in the world in better ways. So working with her, really saying, okay, if this is what I believe internally, like the shifting of beliefs that I was holding, if these things are changing internally, I want to externally make that match. And again, I mentioned it earlier, but it has been this untangling from expectation, from other people's approval, from needing, from being understood, this need to be understood, and, all the things. So there was a lot of untangling from that. And I think just a lot of giving myself permission to try things, experiment with things, to read things that maybe like, once were like off limits, like again, like I was saying, like exploring and just seeing what's out there and allowing, taking what makes sense and leaving what doesn't, and just really expanding my worldview. And yeah, just sitting in spaces and doing things that maybe like I would have never thought that I would be able to, even, years before or whatever. But it's all just expanded and opened me up. Sitting with, I mean, like you mentioned, I mean, obviously a big part of your journey of, being a gay woman and all of that, it's like sitting in these spaces. And I mean, I've been so welcomed by the LGBTQ plus community, and I have some of my dearest friends are a part of that. And really, again, allowing these issues and these things to become human has also been a big part of my journey, because it's not just like, oh, it's wrong, but it's like when we can see and we know, and we get to sit with people that are directly affected by things, we bring it back to the human level, like it just opens us up and expands us in a different way. And so I've done that. That's one of the many issues that and things that I've purposely like put myself in some of those spaces to say like, okay, this is a belief that I was told, let's see if it can hold true, like let me really like, yeah, figure out what I think. And so I've done a lot of renegotiating, a lot of rethinking, a lot of making myself uncomfortable at times with just different things. I mean, like I said, a whole spectrum of stuff. Yeah. And it's just led me to be, I think, a much more loving and humble and kind person in general.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. And I've seen that evolution in you. I've seen you not be as pressured anymore, and trying to be perfect and everything. You've just now, it's like, I even just in this discussion we're having, I'm just like, oh, Courtney, because I have seen you reclaim your power, and I have seen you move forward with an intentional purpose too, as you have been reclaiming who you are. So I know we're getting ready to wrap this up here, but could you just tell the audience just what it is that you do and why you do this?
Yeah, I came up with a bit of a personal mission statement. I don't know when it was, a year or two ago. I feel so passionate about facilitating healing and ensuring that other people know their worth. Because I think that has been from my personal experience. And again, the work that I do here in Romania and that I'm a part of in other places, like there's just something about being empowered and being able to step into who you really are, and to have the support and to have the structure in place to facilitate that journey. It's huge. And so I think that while the subject matter that I tend to focus on is often counter trafficking work or gender-based violence issues in child protection, things like that, the root of it is really, the heart behind it really is to facilitate healing and to ensure that they know that they're worthy and that they're valuable. Because I think that we've talked about this. I think that like there's something about really understanding and almost having your worth or your value become just a fabric of your being. Like when you know that that like I am valuable and I am worthy, it just changes things. Because you're no longer seeking that external approval, and you're no longer needing, this intense belief structure to carry you, because you just know that you're okay. You know that you are worthy. And so that is just a huge passion of mine, to ensure that people know that no matter where they come from, no matter what background they have, no matter how they identify, no matter whatever, like you are worthy and you are valuable, and healing and flourishing as a person is yours. Like that's what you deserve. Yeah.
It sounds like to me that you have everybody on an even playing field.
Yeah.
Nobody's higher than, no one's better than, no one's less than, everybody's on an even playing field. And it sounds as well that this has come because of your own transformation.
Yes.
Your own journey into reclaiming you is causing you to teach other people, to work with other people, to be a clarion call to other people, to reclaim themselves, to know self-love. Self-love is huge. I remember in the church, it would be a lot about God's love for you, but it was like, but we can't love other people if we don't love ourselves. That's what it also says in the Bible. Okay. It doesn't talk about having God's love in that moment. It says you love your neighbor as you love you. And I just feel like that this whole evolution with you of self-love, self-discovery, taking risks to get there, you've had to do some things to reclaim your power. You've had to step into different shoes, step into different boxes, out of boxes, into other spaces so that you could find you. And it does not surprise me that you are doing the work that you're doing, because you're helping pull people out of these confined spaces, these places of rejection, the places of abuse and violence and all of that. And I just want to say, I honor what you do. I've always have. I know that that it's important. It's key to our planet, understanding why things happen the way they do, but what we can do about that. So if somebody wants to know more, or like where you're at, how can they get in touch with you? Because I will put that in the bottom of the notes.
Yeah, sadly, I'm not very active on social media these
I know.
days.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm like maybe at some point in the near future, I'll get a little bit more active. I would say maybe we could just link Rise Collective, my nonprofit. That would probably be the best way. Again, not very active on the social media channels, but if someone wanted to contact me or whatever, just send me a DM through that. happy to respond and to be in touch. And yeah, there's more to come in that space as well. So there should be more information on the interwebs at some point in the near future.
I totally get it. No, I'm following you. Courtney,
Yeah.
this has been wonderful. Thank you for just really taking this time just to share openly, share candidly, just to be yourself. And, you know, you never know, I might come back to Romania when I have to leave the country again, like I did before, come and hang out with
love that. You're always welcome.
and just to touch base with you, but thank you. Thank you for what you do and for who you are. So
yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate you.
Okay, bye.